The concept of the block diagram is simple. The block diagram contains the graphical source code of a LabVIEW program. It separates the source code from the user interface. In a later tutorial, you'll learn in detail about the LabVIEW front panel. For now, what you need to know is that front panel objects appear as block diagram terminals. When you create or open a new VI, the front panel will automatically open. To bring up the block diagram, select Window, Show Block Diagram from the menu bar. Additionally, you can toggle between the block diagram and the front panel by pressing Ctrl-E. The block diagram objects include terminals, which are from the front panel, sub-VIs, functions, constants, structures, and wires, which transfer data among other block diagram objects. You use tools provided by LabVIEW to create, modify, and debug a VI. A tool is a special operating mode of the mouse cursor. The operating mode of the cursor corresponds to the icon of the tool selected. LabVIEW chooses which tool to select based on the location of the mouse. You can manually choose the tool you need by selecting it on the Tools palette. From the menu bar, select View, Tools palette to display the Tools palette. Now you can select the desired tool. The tool will remain selected until you select another tool from the Tools palette. To allow LabVIEW to automatically select the tool, choose the Automatic Tool Selection button. To place objects on the block diagram, you simply drag and drop them from the Functions palette. To bring up the Functions palette, right-click anywhere on the block diagram workspace, and the Functions palette will automatically appear. The Functions palette contains functions, constants, structures, and some sub-VIs. Notice the two buttons on the top of the Functions palette. The thumbtack pins the Functions palette to the block diagram. The Search button opens a search dialog box that can be used to search for functions by name. Click the Search button to launch the Functions search engine. It takes a few moments to launch. You can use this tool to search for functions by name if you're having trouble finding it. Once you see the function you want, double-click on it, and LabVIEW will jump to the place on the Functions palette where that function can be found. Again, to put functions on the block diagram, you simply drag and drop. If you would like to change the visible objects on the Functions subpalette, follow these simple steps. Right-click to bring up the Functions palette, and press the thumbtack. This brings up another button, the View button. Select View, and from the shortcut menu, select Change Visible Categories. In the Change Visible Categories dialog box, you can select the subpalettes that you use the most, or click Select All to include all subpalettes. To change the appearance of the block diagram, simply select Tools and Options from the menu bar. In the Options dialog box, select the Block Diagram category. Here, you can customize the appearance of your block diagram. To save space on the block diagram, deselect Place Front Panel Terminals as Icons. Select OK to save your changes. Now let's consider some of the objects that you'll encounter on a typical block diagram. We'll start with terminals. There are several different kinds of terminals, including controls, which have a corresponding front panel control, indicators, which have a corresponding front panel indicator, as well as functions, which are nodes, and constants. Controls, indicators, and constants behave as inputs and outputs of the block diagram algorithm. Controls receive their values from the front panel and pass data out to other block diagram objects. Indicators receive their value from block diagram logic and pass data from the block diagram to the front panel. Consider an algorithm for computing the area of a triangle. You might have the following front panel and corresponding block diagram. The constant triangle multiplier, shown here, does not necessarily appear on the front panel window, except possibly as documentation of the algorithm. It simply passes the value of 0.5 into the multiply function. Notice that the control, base, and height block diagram terminals have a different appearance from the indicator area. There are two distinguishing characteristics between a control and an indicator on the block diagram. The first is an arrow on the terminal that indicates the direction of data flow. The controls have arrows showing the data leaving the terminal, whereas the indicator has an arrow showing the data entering the terminal. The second distinguishing characteristic is the border around the terminal. Controls have a thick border, and indicators have a thin border. You can create controls and indicators from either the block diagram or the front panel. This will be demonstrated later in this tutorial. Block diagram nodes are objects on the block diagram that have inputs and outputs and perform operations when the VI runs. They are analogous to statements, operators, functions, and subroutines in text-based programming languages. Nodes can be functions, sub-VIs, or structures. Structures are process control elements such as case structures, for loops, or while loops, which will be covered in a later tutorial. Let's look at some different block diagram nodes. Structures, functions, and sub-VIs.